In this video, we're talking about Scott H. Young's The Feynman Technique. So Scott came up with this Feynman technique back in 2011, and this is the main version of it, is this YouTube video. And there's also a PDF, and the PDF will be in the spreadsheet as well. Looks like this. And it's basically just a transcript of what he said in the video. And so we're going to go through the 4 steps of the Feynman process here. And so there's a little story about it, about how basically people would come. Feynman put out this challenge to people that he could understand anything as long as they explained it to him in language he could understand, like simple language. So basically the technique is you choose a concept, you take a blank piece of paper, choose the concept, and then you're going to explain it to a new student in writing with that piece of paper. When you get stuck, you go back to whatever your learning resource is and you try to figure it out and understand it. And then you use analogies to try to make the understanding easier to understand. You simplify language, describe it with an analogy. And there's an example here at this link. So that's what the Feynman technique is. And this was back in 2011, but this thing just went absolutely viral. And you Google search the Feynman technique, and there's all sorts of people talking about it. It's something that's Scott talked about in his Ultra Learning book, which I interviewed him about. You can watch my 3-hour interview with him that we did, I think, a couple years ago now. So the Feynman technique, and he actually did a blog post more recently, and this gets into the philosophy of knowledge and epistemology. How do we know what we know? What is knowledge? One definition you'll hear quite a bit is justified true belief. And so, it gets into how do you define true? What kind of paradigm are you looking at things through? That gets into the more complex side of things. And a lot of times you don't need to do that. But there are certain words that are contested. Different people want to define it in different ways, and that's where you have to get more into the philosophical side of things. But this is really important because, Scott's work has been very influential on me in terms of how I got started. And Scott's always been a role model to me in the accelerated learning space of somebody who really does legit learning. And I did the video on the MIT challenge, which is a great example of that. And so this link down below here is some examples from his MIT challenge where he does the Feynman technique and he explains things to himself. There is a video on Feynman where he talks about the challenge of explaining things. He gives the example of electromagnetism. And he says, there's certain concepts like electromagnetism where there's nothing in your day-to-day life that that phenomena is really similar to. It's kind of its own thing. It's kind of unique. And so there's nothing really you can draw an analogy to. It's kind of its own thing. And so that's the challenge, is sometimes there are things that are fundamentally different that via analogy you can only get so far. So that is a challenge with understanding. This comes up with spiritual or transcendental or transcendent experiences people have. They try to explain it to somebody else and they're like, what are you talking about? And they try to give analogies and stuff like that, but it's still, sometimes you just can't make that connection because the other person hasn't had that experience. Or if somebody tries to explain their experience on some drug, well, if you haven't taken that drug, and even if you hadn't had the same experience, you don't really know what they're talking about. So there are these fundamental problems with language, but overall, the Feynman technique is very important because it's part of metacognition. It's part of, as you're learning, as you're thinking, you need to be aware of, do I actually understand what I'm doing here? Do I understand? It's a form of self-testing, but it helps you get away from the vanity metric of how fast am I reading, how many books am I reading per month or per year, and getting into what really matters, which is, do I understand what I'm learning here? And can I test that? And that's part of the job of the teacher, is to give you a test that can actually show you, do you understand things or not? But when you're a self-directed learner, and that was a big deal with Scott's MIT challenge, he was doing it all himself. He didn't have a teacher giving him feedback or anything. And so he had to test himself. He had to figure it out. And so this Feynman technique is really important for that. Now, part of the backstory of Feynman is that he was known as kind of like Bill Nye the Science Guy in this sense, in the sense that he was seen as, and Neil deGrasse Tyson, these people who are kind of, they're good at explaining science to everyday people. And they have that really deep understanding, but then they have the really good communication skills. And so that's part of where this comes from, is that Feynman is famous for being able to explain things and really get to the crux of the issue and to simplify things. He was brought in for the Challenger disaster under President Reagan. So this was that spaceship that went up and then like exploded in the sky after I think 20 or 30 seconds. And they found that there was I think it was a rubber O-ring that failed because it didn't, when it was super cold, it didn't expand at the same rate as the metal around it or something like that. And so that caused a leak, and then that's my very vague understanding of it. But basically, they brought him in to figure out what actually happened and what went wrong and to be able to explain it. And there is an interesting parallel there, because President Reagan was known as the great communicator. That's kind of his tagline. That's how historians describe him. And so part of learning and testing is communicating with yourself. The Feynman technique is really kind of, you are communicating with yourself. You're imagining this new student, or, on Reddit, it's explain it like I'm 5 years old. But it's that concept of, how do I really break this down into the simplest possible language? Sometimes it can only get so simple. Sometimes you really can't make it any simpler. But at least bring it down to the simplest possible level that you can. And so this is a really important thing that you need to be doing, self-testing as you're going through. And whether you're studying in school and you do need to take a test, or if it's purely self-directed and you just want to make sure you know what you're talking about. And a key thing that I like to do that's kind of related to this is, when I'm talking to a tutor, or I'm talking to an expert or somebody who's allegedly an expert in their field, is I'll just take like a fairly basic concept in their field and I just say, like, what's your definition of that? Or if we get into an argument about what something means, or some argument or discussion about something, I'll just say, well, what's your how do you define that? And that's the kind of thing where the Feynman technique can really help, because you can make sure, like, wow, do I actually know the definition of that? Can I actually give a succinct 1 or 2 sentence explanation or definition, and then maybe expand that out to a paragraph or 2 or a 1-pager? And this is something that you can do kind of at any time as a self-test, is just take out a blank piece of paper and try to write down what you know. Whether that's an outline or it's just sort of an essay type description or explanation of something. But yeah, this is the Feynman technique, and it can really help you prepare for tests and improve your understanding of things. And there's this iterative process of go back to the material and reread it and relearn it until you figure it out. And you probably remember, if you've been watching this whole series, I did a video on Mortimer J. Adler, where how to read a book. And that 4th stage of learning is synoptic reading. Synoptic reading is when you go beyond the book itself to other books in the same genre, in the same academic field. And part of why that's valuable, and part of why I like to do that so much, is because sometimes if you just get one person's explanation, it's not enough. It doesn't really get it to stick. There can be things missing, or there can be ambiguities. That's actually the biggest problem. And this is what frustrates me, particularly in mathematical or scientific or physics books, even programming books, where they'll give you an example and it's a special case of something where like there's two variables that are exactly the same. And so you're not sure you understand it because that one example they give you kind of conflates two different things, or you can't isolate each of the variables and you're not quite sure if you actually understand it. So by getting, talking to a tutor or getting other information sources, whether it's a video, another video course or another book or a YouTube video or whatever, getting another angle on that problem to make sure your understanding is really solid. And when you, and what will happen for some people and what can happen in school is when you are just taking that approach of cramming for a test and then forgetting a lot of it and then taking your summer vacation and then coming back 2-3 months later, you forget some of that foundational knowledge. And so you have a shaky foundation of understanding of the concepts. And then when you try to build on top of them, you struggle and your understanding is weak. And the higher you build like a house of cards, the weaker and more wobbly your understanding becomes because the foundations are not strong. So it's like you want to build on rock, on solid rock, not on sand. And so you really want to understand those fundamental things. That's something that Feynman was really interested in, and what allowed him to do this, take on this challenge that Scott described up top here. So, this is probably the one concept or technique that Scott is most well known for, besides the MIT challenge. And the MIT challenge wasn't really a concept. It was, or a technique. It was more of a challenge and like a big project to take on. So a lot of people have written about the Feynman technique and used it, and it all goes back to, it's putting a label on this idea of doing a self-test. And it represents part of the paradigm shift of going from learning in school where you have somebody else testing you to being self-directed and having an iterative process where you don't just take a test at the end, but at a micro scale. It's kind of like an agile, I don't know if that's a perfect analogy, but it's kind of like an agile, iterative development approach where you do a little bit, build a little something, test it out, build a little bit more, test it out. And so before taking the big test, you're giving yourself these little tests where you're explaining it, making sure you can explain it. If you don't, you go back and fix it, read a little more, learn a little more, come back, get a nice, fully finalized explanation. And then, a next step that you can do from this is turn that into a flashcard. And part of how you can think about flashcards is like what can happen is if you're creating flashcards and you don't understand the concept and you're just copying and pasting something into a flashcard, then you can memorize like kind of a cloud, vague idea of something, but it's never going to really feel strong, even if you memorize it word for word, if you don't actually understand the concept and you can't explain it. So this is something that's useful as an approach to kind of generalize the approach. Anytime you're writing something down that's going to go into some finalized format, whether it's a personal wiki or it's note cards or it's kind of a one-pager you're putting together to study for an exam, let's say, MIT challenge is an example of that. You want to do the work to figure out what's a really good explanation of this. Do I really understand it? Before moving on to the next thing. And another concept related to this is mastery learning. So mastery learning and Khan Academy has been big in kind of popularizing this and implementing it into their e-learning software, where you don't go to the next step until I think you answer 9 out of 10 questions correctly. They want to make sure you really understand the concept. And so I see a strong connection between these two. Feynman Technique is doing it for yourself and making sure you understand the concept. Something like mastery learning and mastery testing make sure from an external point of view, you can actually solve problems. So with the Feynman Technique, it doesn't necessarily get into like, okay, let's test your explanation out in the real world. You could go do that. You could go find multiple choice practice questions and actually do it. These are the kind of things where if you had infinite time, it'd be nice to do it. But when you are self-directed and you have bills to pay and you have a schedule to keep, this is usually the best you're going to be able to do. And then if you do have a way to test it, or you're going to implement the project into some kind of real world thing, which for a lot of you, that's what you're doing with practical learning projects, is just going and implementing them. So these are my overall thoughts on the Feynman Technique. I recommend you do check out Feynman because he's just a really interesting guy, very good communicator. And if you're interested in teaching, especially in communication and teaching, and being a good teacher is being a good explainer. And that's something I focus a lot on. And part of how I think I developed my own teaching skills is having 4 younger brothers and constantly having to think about, like, I need to explain this to them. They don't have the same knowledge as I do, and being forced to be very aware of what does the other person know? What do they have in their head? This is called theory of mind. It's another word for it. What do they know? What are the Lego building blocks that they have in their collection? And I can only build the idea up based on the Legos that they have. So if I have red and green and yellow and blue Legos, but they only have red and green, then I have to build up the concept only using my red and green Lego blocks. I can't use the blue and the yellow ones, even though I have them, because the other person doesn't. So in the same way, that's kind of what you're doing with each concept. Before you write it down on paper, before you say it to the other person, you're thinking, in their little mental dictionary, the person who's listening to me, the person who I'm kind of imagining that I'm writing this Feynman Technique report to, this Feynman Technique explanation to, do they have this word in their mental dictionary? And then if they do they have the same understanding of that word that I do? Are they using the same sense of it? Like if you look up in the dictionary, there's 5 definitions for a word. Each of those is called a sense of the word. And sometimes academics will do a literature review of what some major important word means. Like in anthropology, there's over 100 definitions of the word culture by different academics, like distinct definitions that have different meanings. And then they kind of summarize it or try to cluster it together or whatever. But the point is, does the other person I'm communicating with have the same definition of the word as I do? And do they even have that word in their dictionary? And if they don't have both of those things, then that teaching, that explanation is not going to work. And so this anecdote about Feynman and how he challenged people in the mathematics department to explain stuff to him, and as long as there were no complicated words or words he didn't understand, that's what I'm talking about with the dictionary. No complex words means the word has to be in his dictionary. And then the definition that they're using needs to be the sense that he understands. Or if there's 2 or 3 senses, he needs to understand the one that, the math student who's challenging him is talking about. And as long as he has those Lego blocks, he can build up the same understanding. So that's where this idea comes from. And, despite some of the philosophical issues of understanding and philosophy of knowledge, I think it's tough and there are connotations and nuances to things, and you can get into sort of connectionist definitions of language and everybody having sort of their own definitions of things and kind of that approach. Ultimately, this is a very strong approach to to learning. And I think it can be buttressed by those other things. I think it can be buttressed by, there's kind of connotation and then there's denotation. So I would say this approach talks about denotation, which is sort of like the dictionary definition. Connotation has to do with what is the context that this tends to be used in. And that's basically a statistical question. And in machine learning and AI and natural language processing, this can be represented statistically as what words tend to show up before this word, what words tend to show up after this word within a certain window. And so that can be represented computationally, kind of statistically, but there's really no human readable resources that really give you that. So those kind of connotations can be useful for understanding and explaining things. And sometimes that's the best that you can get in certain fields. Physics, the hard sciences, connotation is not as important. It's more about denotation. And especially in physics and in computer science and math, the whole idea is that you have that small axiom set and you kind of build up from there, and it's all mathematized. And so math kind of by definition is supposed to be, complete. It's supposed to be just sort of doing your logical syllogisms and your logical operations. And so it is meant and largely is able to be just concepts are able to be built on top of each other, very much like Lego bricks. When you get into the social sciences, when you get into the humanities, that's where things get a lot more fuzzy. There's like dozens or hundreds of different theories, and they all have different definitions of terms, or they use different sets of terms, and they can get very complex and very confusing. So, and that's where the connotative aspect of things and the context and understanding different authors' perspectives and being able to hold in your head a lot of different people's perspectives and schools of thought, and which definitions are connected to which people or which schools of thought, and the kind of cluster of words and their kind of unique vocabulary that they use within that subfield or school of thought, or even within an individual, how they define certain words or avoid defining them. There's plenty of these people in humanities, for example, they'll never define key words. And the only way is you can retrieve it kind of from context. So a lot of different things there, but ultimately this is the key approach. You can't be focused on the vanity metrics. You have to be focused on actually understanding the stuff that you're learning. And if you really want to make sure you understand it, you need to do a practice like this where you're explaining it and you're kind of self-testing. And you want to make it an iterative process. So you're not just this one big test at the end. And if you're self-directed, you're usually not doing something like that. So make sure you're doing a little bit of self-testing as you go. Make sure you're just writing stuff down, even if it's in the margins. Pull out a piece of paper, write it down. When you're making your flashcards, I think for a lot of you, if you're at the point where you're making flashcards or you're taking serious notes, this should kind of be a key part of your metacognition as you're doing that. As you're creating the flashcards, as you're making your notes, you're kind of applying the Feynman technique of, do I actually understand this? And really challenge yourself so that you do it once, you do it right, you get that explanation, you pour the concrete, and then you're going to be able to build on that as you learn more advanced concepts. So that's it for this video. Let me know what you think down below. Make sure you like and subscribe if you want to get more content like this. And there'll be a link in the description to get all the resources for all the stuff in this playlist, all the PDFs and videos, and it's updated over time, and you'll get all those updates because it's a Google Sheet basically. And there'll also be a link to the playlist where you can watch all the other videos in this series, including the MIT Challenge video. So that's it for this video, and I'll see you in the next one.